concerns regarding stormwater runoff and the water being inundated with runoff from the drainage. And I did forward that to the civil engineer of record. I think they may have had some communication, but I believe the engineer will further elaborate on how they can make the necessary accommodations to convey the water in the right location on site to be treated properly. So we believe staff analysis, the fact that there is an existing hardship that exists, there is an undue hardship that exists on the site, being steep slopes. The request is not self-imposed. They're dealing with the existing physical characteristics of the property. But we do have a concern over drainage and how stormwater will be treated. So I believe with the condition of approval that they comply with the geotechnical analysis as well as acquire appropriate building permits, the concerns can be reasonably mitigated. And I stand for any questions that you have.
I don't have anything for you right now, Vlad. Thank you. Okay, now we'll hear from the applicant or the representative. I have a card from Eric Olson.
That's me. Jeremy's going to be leading the presentation today.
Okay. Jeremy, how do you spell your last name?
Terzulli.
Your handwriting is very interesting.
Hopefully I won't be graded on my handwriting this evening. Jeremy Terzulli. I am a project coordinator with Olson Engineering. Eric Olson is the engineer of record on this. He's here this evening. I reside in Hauser, Idaho. Olson Engineering is based out of Post Falls, Idaho. This is with regard, as Vlad mentioned, to the Lazar request for a variance. I'd like to start with a little bit of clarification with regard to what we're actually asking for here. It seems that there can sometimes be a little misinterpretation of what is actually being requested. People think that we're requesting a variance from a setback and that ultimately we intend to request a building permit to put a structure 10 feet from East Hayden Lake Road. That would be incorrect. So how we got here, often on platted lots and throughout the rest of the community when there's more orderly development, the jurisdictions will gain the right-of-way with which to put a roadway in, sidewalks if necessary, roadside swales. Those right-of-ways typically are anywhere between 50 and 75 feet. In a situation like this where East Hayden Lake Road was likely a gravel road many, many years ago, and then as the area developed up, these lakefront homes were put on there. The road was ultimately paved and the highway district took over possession of the road. At that point, there was no defined right-of-way. So Kootenai County, within their code, has a caveat that says in situations like this, you implement what's referred to as a prescriptive easement. Everybody knows the roadway is there. It is maintained by the highway district. It's how everybody gets access all along the road, although it's not officially platted with a right-of-way from the center line of the road. 25 feet in each direction is what's referred to as a prescriptive easement. If you look all up and down East Hayden Lake Road, you'll see many structures are nearly directly adjacent to that right-of-way, that prescriptive easement. Some are within 5 or 10 feet. And so the misconception is that we plan to plunk a structure 10 feet from the edge of the asphalt, which is not the case. The physically built road extends about 10 to 12 feet from the center line, and then you deal with steep slopes either up or down. So I've got a couple of exhibits up here on the slide that shows the proposed structure is actually 24 feet from the physically built road, not 10 feet from the physically built road. And as you'll see in a further slide, I've clarified that even a little bit more, but I kind of wanted to get that clarification out of the way as we move forward. And then I have another can't move, Vlad. So these are exhibits taken from the county GIS mapping system. The one on the left shows 25 feet measured from the center line of the road, and of course this is a GIS map. It's usually good to within a foot or so. So you'll see right there is a full-size SUV currently off of the asphalt structure. So if you take the 25 feet from the center line of the road, and then an additional 10 feet is where the structure would be. If you look to the right over here, this is a very crude outline of where the driveway surface would be. That's edge of road, that's face of structure. That SUV right there, you could imagine being parked in that driveway fairly simply. So just as a point of clarification, I wanted to get that out of the way, and then I'll move through some of the criteria with which we have to work with regarding this request. So the first one speaks of procedural requirements. The application was submitted, deemed complete by county staff. All fees have been paid by the homeowner, Mark Lazar. Agencies were notified and the public was notified properly to bring us here today to a properly noticed public hearing. Number 2 up here, as listed as B1, talks about the undue hardship, and Vlad pointed that out. The undue hardship is the fact that we have a very steep slope moving from East Hayden Lake Road up to Upper Hayden Lake Road. It is fairly consistent at 40% as we move from that ditch line all the way up to Upper Hayden Lake Road. It's consistent. There are no noticeable flat areas until you get all the way up to Upper Hayden Lake Road, which would actually be within that prescriptive right-of-way as well. So it's not as though we haven't explored other options with which is there a flat building site that we could get creative with a driveway to get up there. It's a consistent 40% slope from the lower road to the upper road. We deem this hardship as exceptional. If the structure was to be positioned 25 feet from the easement, and again, that would mean roughly 40 feet from the edge of the pavement, we would be dealing with a fairly extensive excavation and export of material. Additional retaining walls would need to be put in, perhaps some terracing, and additional measures would have to happen within construction to protect the slopes during excavation and construction. You can't simply just carve out a piece. You have to have proper side slopes with which to maintain the integrity while construction is happening. And that exhibit right there, I'm sorry, this exhibit right here is kind of, Vlad brought one up in his presentation as well, shows the structure was shifted back an additional 15 feet. You would be looking at all this as an additional cut section, plus some to maintain slopes. This retaining wall would be roughly 4 times larger. And so we believe that that does indicate a fairly substantial hardship. Is the hardship self-imposed? As Vlad pointed out, no, these conditions have existed long before East Hayden Lake Road was even in existence and home sites began being built around East Hayden Lake Road. And to go back to the point of the prescriptive easement, that prescriptive easement is put in place as a countywide blanket to help alleviate situations like this. It doesn't take into account site-specific, and by that I mean most of our lakes in Kootenai County are within mountainous terrain, and so therefore there are steep slopes. It's everywhere throughout the county, and it doesn't take into account that this specific location has a multitude of structures that are built very close to the road that was typically gravel, and then as development happened, turned into a paved and a public maintained road. So it doesn't take into account the topography. It just helps alleviate those issues countywide, so it's not specific to each location. So it's another point where we feel like, again, the hardship was not something that's self-imposed. The Lazars would be within their right to propose a structure on this property that could meet all of the setbacks, and they're simply asking for this variance to help alleviate some of that hardship. Is this approval going to affect the adjacent property owners? And it is our assessment that no, it is not. I have brought the engineer of record and also the geotechnical engineer who is a specialist in this type of thing, and he's going to speak on this a little bit more later in my presentation. But we believe we've come up with a very comprehensive plan and methodology that will not only alleviate the concerns of neighboring properties, but in essence improve the situation area-wide. There's a plan in place for the retaining walls, how those will be constructed, how they'll be reinforced, how we're going to protect the slopes during construction, how we're going to revegetate the area. And we believe at the end of the day, we will have improved the groundwater situation and the stormwater situation, not only on this lot, but within the area. Next would be, is the approval of this variance going to change the character of the zone? And as I kind of alluded to earlier, this is the neighborhood context. Lakefront homes, some of them have dwelling units or accessory units or garages on the opposing side of the road because the road does bisect many of the parcels here. It is very consistent with that pattern. It's consistent with the development patterns along this area of East Hayden Lake Road. And Lakes Highway District, in essence, confirmed that with their letter when they were solicited for comment. And I have a direct quote from the Highway District that says the variance will have little impact on district maintenance operations and is consistent with typical construction in the area. Moving on, does the approval of this variance adversely affect the health and safety, general welfare of the citizens of Kootenai County or East Hayden Lake Road specifically? Again, I feel that not only does it not affect the health and safety, but it will improve it. And we believe it'll improve it because some of the public comment received, which we felt was very accurate, this is a fairly narrow corridor with large trees and highly vegetated. There are many blind corners. We believe it will improve the sight lines along the narrow roadway. We believe that that 24-foot from physically built road to the face of the structure will give vehicles, the Lazars and their guests, an opportunity to maneuver within the driveway and not wind up backing out onto the road. Just as a frame of reference, 24 to 25 feet is the typical drive aisle in a commercial site. So if you pull into Walmart or any other commercial site around the county, the area between parking stalls that you're allowed to maneuver and swing into parking stalls, those are designed at 24 feet. So that gives you a frame of reference. An individual with a full-size SUV can back out of a garage and easily perform a three-point turn and be nosing out as they move out of East Hayden Lake Road. So, and again, the engineers are going to speak more to this in a little bit. We believe that the stormwater and the groundwater is going to be significantly improved with the development of this site. So these are some of the photos that were received by the neighbors, and some of their concerns were the runoff and the fact that this site remains damp through much of the year. There is some groundwater and there is some storm water. It does run down the embankment and sort of collect in a loosely defined ditch at the edge of the roadway. It appears silty and dirty. I'm going to allow the geotech to kind of talk to those points and how we're going to alleviate those. Before I hand it over to Chris Comstock, do you have any questions for me up to this point?
No, thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Chris Comstock, geotechnical engineer, to talk more to the water issues on the site. Chris.
Thanks, Jerry. Hello.
Silver.
Good evening. Thank you for letting me be here. My name is Chris Comstock. My address is 15854 Middle Fork Road, Hauser, Idaho, 83854. I've been there since 2008, lived in Kootenai County. Born in Moscow, Idaho, got my master's in geological engineering in 2003. Spent 4.5 years in Boise, decided to come back home in 2008. And have been up here working in the geotechnical design and construction field since then. My single shingles consultancy, if you will, revolves around geologic challenges, hillside lots, development in complex conditions. Because quite frankly, as I look around, there's not a whole lot of gray-haired geotechnical engineers around. And I have the most experience in the geology of the area, being a licensed geologist and a licensed engineer as well. So I've been in a lot of failed crawl spaces and foundations on the lake shores, and I am doing currently quite a few custom residential or commercial projects on Coeur d'Alene, Hayden, and various lakes around here. So quite familiar with the geology of this area, and I was contacted by Eric Olson, who asked my advice regarding, is the hillside stable? It's a question I get a lot. Is the hillside stable? My phrase, or my turnkey answer is that depends. All of them are moving, and we can build anything we built the Hoover Dam. I need to see it in order to determine to what extent it might be moving and what you plan to build there or not. So I went out to the site prior to taking a contract to meet the owner and to look at the site itself, and to be blunt, make sure that they weren't planning 8 condo units on an area that we probably shouldn't be building condos on geologically. So my immediate reaction to the site was, yes, it is wet. However, it is mapped as a transition area between 2 geology types, as is the entire corridor. So I would say it is prototypical geologically on a, let's say, that side of the lake standpoint. Along this stretch, it happens to be somewhat unique in that there is a short stretch of flowing water. Okay, that's not as common, but along that whole stretch, but I'm aware of 2 other projects that water begins just up the hill at about the same elevation and then openly flows parts of the year. So I looked at the site and asked the owner what they planned to do on that site, and his motivation was keep it from running into the roadway first. The owners were not satisfied with the performance of that slope. The topography doesn't show it. Is this the pointer here? This topographic bulge right there just happens to be an area where I believe that there's strong evidence that there's oozing or flowing of the soil slow rate into that, nearly the right of way it looks like, or the edge of pavement at least. So I took the contract to foremost advise the owner in what types of systems they could do, or revegetation or drainage, to stabilize the hillside. And if possible, possibly use that area for a widened pull-off or some kind of usable space, but not at the expense of the stabilization. Okay. So I hired a local contractor to excavate these test pits. By the way, this doesn't show it, but the roadway, Upper Hayden Lake Road, am I saying that right? Is right here. So digging the holes, I focused around this area because the surface expression showed that this had the most hummocky ground, if you will, which is kind of unstable, rolling a bit. The trees in that area, there were no mature trees. The trees that were there were leaning and had recorrected toward the sun. However, the area along this ridge here and this ridge here, the trees exhibited much less curvature. And without boring everybody to death, I believe there's a geologic contact just uphill of this bubbled area between a kind of a basalt and an underlying metamorphic geology. Either way, this expression that's surveyed right there, this is the surveyor independently documenting a location where surface water comes out of the hill. I targeted that area and looked around, and in summary, everything in this area is moving at a rate in which I would call progressive, or let's say seasonal downward creep. It moves slightly in the spring because of seepage forces. It also moves because it freezes perpendicular to the slope, but thaws vertically downward. And there's a reason Kansas is flat. This soil wants to get to the Pacific Ocean, and Mother Nature's progressing that at a much quicker rate in this area than the surrounding hillsides, okay? And geologically, I split it into young and old soils. There's 3 to 5 feet roughly of what I call young soils, i.e. they have been deposited since the last ice age. The Missoula flood, it's about 8,500 years ago. That is the thickness of material that has never been compressed, cemented, stabilized in any way. And it moves, as evident in the trees. Below that was a soil I don't get to log very often called an elastic silt. It's highly organic, and geologically it is tertiary aged, which means it's over 10 million years old. It's been there a long time. It's had a lot of pressure on it. And although it's not rock, it can appear rock-like when dry. Below that was basalt bedrock. And I was able to penetrate a few feet into the basalt before reaching what I call refusal. The teeth on the excavator are smoking, which means the basalt is so hard by inspection I don't have to test it or do anything to determine its adequacy to support load. So in simple terms, I started high and dug a geologic profile down the hill until I hit bedrock finally in TP1, basalt bedrock. I didn't hit it in these borings. However, I'm having a geological engineering license and familiarity with the area. I know these basalt layers are nearly horizontal, and that solid layer underlies the entire site. Everything above that is either old organic silt. I would call that middle of the road properties. Not good, not bad, but okay. Everything in the upper 3 to 5 feet, I recommend removal, not relying upon removing on site, etc. It's the problem child. Getting to the point, to the punchline, so to speak, my resulting recommendations are the hillside is overall, it is globally stable with evidence of near surface, small scale failures and or progressive creep over time. It is dictated entirely by groundwater and the extent groundwater is in the soil. And if we could get to the next. So that was my geologic map, and this turns into what do I recommend from a preliminary standpoint, which we'll talk about why it's preliminary. This area right here, I recommended avoiding excavation for a lot of reasons, but mostly because I am familiar with the geology, and it becomes more problematic or potentially variable as you get up the hill in elevation. At the start of the spring, this is where the geology gets better, but because the elastic silt is impermeable, it produces water. Water perches in the upper 3 to 5 feet and expresses itself here. So regardless of any development, whether this is a purple house, blue house, rock wall, retaining wall, or anything, I recommended first and foremost cut the water off through the draw in the upper 3 to 5 feet, which is producing the biggest factor toward downslope movement. And that should be correctly and properly designed to be disposed and distributed to a proper location. Quite frankly, when it gets out of the ground, it no longer becomes my jurisdiction as much as the in-the-ground stuff. So I've recommended things like clean outs here, and not just an uphill cutoff drain, but a perimeter foundation drain around the entirety of the structure with clean outs such that there can be operated and maintained into the future. A lot of the problems I see occur 30 to 50 years after these homes were built. And as a licensed engineer, I'm not going to participate in that kind of project. So moving forward, in order to physically excavate anything, regardless of how close it is to the road, I recommended a long-term permanent slope armoring in this area. This is the area of the maximum slumpage, movement, saturated ground. Can't do anything, stabilize or build a home unless you take care of that area. Furthermore, and we'll come back to this one, because of the magnitude of this excavation for this black structure, this black frame structure or the red frame structure, the upper few feet of the slope, this is in cross section now, has to be stabilized in the short term and in the long term. So that was a big finding of mine. And I tried to work with the team to find what I call the sweet spot, where it's far enough up the hill in order to unload this footprint at the toe. The sloppy material at the toe is weak and saturated, and I would recommend getting it up off of the ground. In other words, more dump trucks leave the site than dump trucks come onto the site. And then creating a structure, whatever that structure may be, that buttresses the hillside. But to physically dig a hole, this has to be armored, and again, what I've assumed as the licensed engineer in this preliminary stage is that there will be a drainage along this line. This is about 12 inches under that footing, this is about 12 inches under that footing. Some contractors will move a foot over and dig straight up. Again, I can't advocate that necessarily, even if it works. This is an OSHA compliant 1/2 to 1 slope, which in my interpretation is appropriate for those soils. Although I'm not designing the excavation, I'm vetting it, and this is what I consider a worst case safe excavation. I vetted it for large failures, etc. However, because of going back, this zone right here, and putting other infrastructure improvements at risk, I'm kind of advocating, let's stay out of this zone with any potential issues. And by excavating a safe, stable excavation here, for this type of a home, it also gives us a little bit of buffer in case we do have, let's say we have a 5-year winter and building production shut down and this hole had to sit open. This slope would have to fail over many, many winters before it would ever encroach onto some public improvements, in my opinion. So I call this the sweet spot, again, where this void in this zone here is taken off site because of its weakness and unsuitability, let's say. This becomes the buttress. It may be more of an expensive buttress than I would personally build to choose, like a wall, let's say. However, this is a much more efficient construction by cheating it into the hill and removing this weight and then making sure this box doesn't move. And that's through design, by retaining a geotechnical engineer and a structural engineer to design the footings, the weight of the home, the footprint, etc. against any movement in the long term. So what I see here is, this is the worst case ground surface, and these are the two ground surfaces, worst and best case, is we've got a wedge of material here and here that we're getting off of the site, and groundwater used to be at the ground surface, and it used to flow out of the ground right there. In fact, I believe that's what we see right there. It is groundwater, it is Mother Nature doing its thing, and unless you dig up East Hayden Lake Avenue 100 feet below the ground surface, you're never gonna get rid of Mother Nature's water up above the lot. So our approach is to intercept it shallow here, to an appropriate disposal, intercept it everywhere along this red line. And we'll put in what I consider the most important piece of infrastructure on the whole project is a pipe right here and a pipe right here that then gets metered to an appropriate stormwater system. But now we have unloaded the site, number one, drained the site in this corridor, number two, and created a buttress of material to keep the hillside back. And everything in this zone here will be 1 order of magnitude more drained than the native hillside, i.e. the water has to collect in this foundation drain and then be distributed out and about. But essentially, because our line exists entirely on our property, we're not changing the groundwater regime forever. We're only changing it between about right here and right here. Okay? There will be some lowering uphill. And the real impacts to the adjacent properties will probably be a net reduction in groundwater. providing the rest of the project team has designed this to drain appropriately, which presumably would happen. So those were my findings. That was an overall synopsis of how we got to moving the building into this sweet spot. If the building is moved here and this excavation becomes large, I do believe we're at jeopardy of large land failures. OSHA uses 20 feet vertically as a cutoff for whether an engineer has to design an excavation or not. And even if this excavation is 22 feet, it has an escape route this way and and is legal. But the minute you put this rectangle into the hill more, it would require an engineering design, probably a lot more physical stabilization simply to construct the project, let alone construct the hill, or to stabilize the hillside, excuse me. So I think in conclusion, I wanted to comment on the preliminary nature. I will not produce a final report and sign and stamp it until I understand what is being constructed, and that I understand the loads on the footings, the final grading, because even though I know what this looks like, no one else in this room has an idea what this looks like. It has to be constructed properly, and it has to be designed in more detailed, vetted, reviewed, and then implemented. So this preliminarily informs the team moving forward such that they can create detailed plans and specifications. And once the building footprint and the grading are nailed down, the structural engineer can step in and use my recommendations to do their design. Unfortunately, it's a chicken and the egg. I can't provide recommendations for the structural engineer until I understand how heavy the building is. So now what we're doing is preliminarily vetting feasibility, putting a range of design parameters that are suitable for them to begin in, but I won't stamp it until I know that it's a viable project. So that's all I have to present, and I'd be happy to stand for some questions.
Very clear explanations. Thank you very much. I just have one question. I think it's probably better answered by,
Jeremy?
There's a galvanized pipe, half pipe, on the west side of the hill
Yes,
that was running freely today. Where's that water coming from?
that's also coming from the groundwater. That was some previous property owner, as my understanding is, some previous property owner's attempt to divert the water. To my knowledge, it wasn't done by this property owner. It simply, somebody tried to divert some of that water when it came up.
But that water is also intended to be addressed with this design? Or will it be-
Site-wide. So
Okay.
I was hoping Chris would get a little more technical with his explanation, but we'll have to take his remedial assessment of it. That was sarcasm. The intent is site-wide and even into the margins. We believe that the plan, and it is in its preliminary stages, we had a little pre-meeting prior to this, and he said, if I get rid of all this garbage and that wedge that he talks about, right? That right now is creating resistance for all that water coming. That's why it's coming to the surface. It's hitting resistance, and you've got a slope coming down. It hits resistance, and it starts to kind of, sled out, and then it shows itself out onto the surface, right? When we excavate the proper margins and we bring it back in with pervious material, drain rock, a massive French drain behind this structure, all other water moving out is going to move towards the path of least resistance. It's gonna take our bait and come towards this void where we're gonna capture it, send it down the hill, and send it into appropriate stormwater drains. Work with the county, work with the highway district, and get it where it needs to go, much cleaner than it currently is. Because groundwater, the reason it's all muddy and mucky by the time it gets to that roadside ditch, it's picking up all the silt on the surface. Groundwater comes out clear, no different than if we drilled a well, that water's gonna come up clean. It's when it gets towards the top where loose, muddy, mucky soil, and then it generates this sludge as it moves down the hill. We're gonna set bait for the groundwater to go to the path of least resistance. That's sort of the idea. As far as that little half section of pipe, that looked like some classic North Idaho engineering at work there as an attempt to get the water somewhere else. It wasn't done by this property owner, and we hope to alleviate that situation permanently.
I know that in other cases I've heard over the years in that area, there have been a lot of concerns with other sites where there's a lot of instability, and you can still drive around and see some sites that look like they've collapsed in on themselves. Sounds to me like they need you guys.
They did not have this team of professionals. It was actually brought up at our pre-meeting. Chris very politely said I would have never put my name on what, they just started hacking into the hillside. They drop some trees, they roll an excavator in there, and they just start scooping away. I'm obviously biased, but I would agree, they do need the type of team that we've put together.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Not right now.
Okay, perhaps we'll see you at rebuttal.
Okay. All right. All right. I have Eric Pedersen, and you didn't indicate whether you're in favor, opposed, or neutral, but that you do wish to speak.
Oh, yeah, I do wish to speak. I'm in favor of them getting the variance, if that's what in favor means.
Okay.
Okay. My name is Eric Pedersen. We live, we're 112A, so we're just right up on the other side of Upper Hayden Lake Road from this. I don't have anything technical to add, so it's going to sound nothing like that. But I just wanted to come and say, because we know what it's like to have to deal with things, and especially we know it's like to dig on a place like this, and it can be very difficult, and government can make things very difficult sometimes. And when they decide to not make things difficult, it is amazing how much easier your life becomes. And so I just wanted to come down and say, I think that we're obviously all for it. And I feel like government, whenever possible, should be eager to make people's lives easier. And same thing with neighbors. I mean, like sometimes you'll get neighbors complaining about stuff. And I'm like, why are you complaining about that? I'm like, who cares? These people are your neighbors. You're supposed to be wanting to make your neighbors' lives easier. So anyway, I'm here just saying we want to make our neighbors' lives easier. And we think they should get the variance. That's it.
Well, thank you. So that's all we have in person. Do we have Zoom people who wish to give testimony?
Tim Williams is on Zoom and has indicated he would like to speak. Tim, why don't you go right ahead?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Tim Williams. I live at 2935 East Hayden Lake Road, Hayden, Idaho. We are the adjacent neighbor to the west, and our property is along the lakefront adjacent to the Lazar's property as well. So we have a easement road of Hayden Lake Road that runs between our lots. So our concern, we've been here 12 years, and so we've seen a lot of the runoff problems. And my concern, as is my neighbor to the west of me, who I know is also written and some comments as such, the water that you're referring to that runs freely down that slope has always run. I don't care if it's the driest summer ever, there's water running down that. And it has gone into the lake. We've actually see the mud coming in the lake because we have out right by our seawall, and the mud that it carries just comes right down, and we can see the discoloration into the lake. I'm not opposed to them actually, to anyone building anything there. I'm concerned with the runoff of that water and it being diverted. Our particular lot, which is adjacent to this variance lot, is completely dry. We've never had any water problem, but that particular lot, the Lazars this last year had to redo their seawall on the lakefront. And during the construction, they lost about 10 feet that went into the water because of all of the runoff that's running under the house, which comes off that lot, goes down through the underneath the road and into the lake. So I'm concerned that when it's being disturbed, and I know I appreciate the engineering report that they've provided, and but the concern is the word probably not do anything, probably will improve it. My concern is obviously that it won't improve it and it could make it worse. We've seen 2 construction sites within 3 lots to the west and one adjacent to the Lazars. They carved out a parking area along Hayden Lake Road, and it all completely caved down this year onto the road. So there's definitely a water issue, and I'm cautious about that particular piece of land just because the lots around it are pretty dry, but that particular lot is very, very wet. And actually, Hayden Lake Water and Sewer thought they had a sewer break last summer, and they went up in there, and the guy who walked that lot said it was like a swamp in that, and he went quite a ways up, almost at Upper Hayden Lake Road, and it was just as wet. So I'm just concerned with the potential for, with this being disturbed and the water diverting to our land, and also just potentially causing disruption with removing trees and roots and stuff that are actually holding that land together. And I'm also, one other thing I wanted to note that I did put in what I sent in comments is that unique to this particular part of Hayden Lake Road is that, the first mile and a half or so, or mile in from Honeysuckle is fairly, it's a fairly straight area, but right after the Lazars property, there's one lot in between is a blind corner. And as it is right now, the Lazars can't even back out safely onto Hayden Lake Road. They have to turn around in their driveway a complete 360 to get out to crawl, kind of edge because of that blind corner. So, I'm glad that, I appreciate the clarification of what the 10-foot variance would be, and that it isn't like 10 feet off the road. But I still am concerned that with that blind corner, and unfortunately people go way, way too fast on this road. It's 25 miles an hour through here, but I have seen people going speeds excess like 45, 50 miles an hour and even passing on this road. So there's just a lot of concerns.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. Do we have anyone else?
Henry may wish to.
Yeah, I would like to testify, Jeff Harvey.
Okay, say the name again,
Go
please.
ahead. I'm Jeffrey Harvey, 5925 East Hayden Lake Road, Hayden Lake. And I represent the Hayden Lake Watershed Association in this particular case. I drive by this place, this lot every day, usually, on my way in and out from my home. We don't really have any issue with the building. I wish that several, and Dave Callahan knows this, I wish that several other excavations along the South Shore were as well thought out as this, at least geotechnical work done on it. The only concern I have here is the French drain is a great idea, and will focus the groundwater. My only issue is what happens to it once you capture it. There's not much space between, as everybody knows, between Lower Hayden Lake Road and the lake. And the only flat place to treat anything is the road itself. So I guess our issue would be, and what we would like to see is, okay, now you've captured this stormwater and groundwater. How is it going to be basically, especially the stormwater, allowed to settle before it enters the lake? Because our great concern is the lake itself.
Okay, thank you very much.
One Katrina, do you wish to speak?
Yeah, I'd just like to testify support of the applicant request. I don't have any comments.
Okay, Katrina Henry, and your address?
Yes. My address, excuse me, sorry. I own lot 111A. It's directly behind this lot.
Okay, great, go.
I'd just like to testify support
Okay,
of the applicant request. I don't have any comments.
okay, thank you. Anyone else?
I believe that's it. Is there anyone else at this time on Zoom?
Okay. Vlad, you have something? Yes, please.
Before the applicant proceeds with their rebuttal, I just want to make sure that we as staff have captured the much needed geotechnical analysis, full-blown geotechnical analysis prior to any development on site. As you have read, conditions 706 and 707 deal directly with requirement for a site disturbance permit as well as building permit, and both conditions reference the geotechnical report that was submitted. I realize that that's a preliminary report, and based on the comments that Mr. Comstock had made, I want to make sure that what he said, this is not a final evaluation. In fact, he said, I will not sign off until I know what the structure looks like and it's been properly designed by the structural engineer. My question to you, the hearing examiner, as well as the geotechnical engineer, is under condition 707, the last statement says, additional geotechnical evaluation may be required at the discretion of the geotechnical engineer and or Kootenai County Building Division official. So it's a rare instance where I leave conditions open-ended. I want to make sure that if there is any more direct requirement is necessary from Mr. Comstock or Mr. Olson, that it be embedded into this condition, or if Mr. Comstock could further elaborate what exactly he will be submitting so we can include that as a directive in 707. I'm a little uncomfortable with an open-ended condition. So if he could further elaborate in his rebuttal, and we could incorporate that into 707, I would appreciate it.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, who's gonna handle Eric?
Eric Olson with Olson Engineering in Post Falls. Appreciate all the comments and the attendance from the neighbors. Mr. Williams reiterated his concerns on groundwater, as did Mr. Harvey expressed that it sounds like this is really an issue here, and so we see this structure as it's actually an opportunity to help solve a problem that they've got out there. So that's kind of cool. Mr. Lazar, if he's able to build this structure, has hired a very competent team, multifaceted, and I'm not sure he could, I guess I should stop short of bragging, but I think he's got the best team to handle this project. So Chris is going to deal with the groundwater side, and then as he said, once it gets in the pipe, that's, as the civil engineer, then that's my issue to determine what happens at that point. So we're going to have whatever runoff comes off of the proposed features that's required as part of the site disturbance ordinance to be captured, and a certain level of treatment and detention provided so that we're not discharging more water than was discharged previously. On the groundwater side, as Chris alluded to earlier, or maybe it was Jeremy, when we capture that groundwater before it hits the surface, it's clean. So that's clean water that can go to the lake. It doesn't need to be treated. It's just going to be more efficiently handled. It's going to discharge into the catch basin and culvert system that already routes that water to the lake. That's the intent. So basically what'll happen is we're gonna collect all the groundwater, including what's going in that half culvert right now, what's gonna come out of that French drain. That's gonna get pushed straight through. Whatever's coming through the site's gonna have a detention component, and then it's also gonna be discharged along that same existing route towards the lake. And then Vlad asked if Chris could elaborate more on the specific, what he intends to provide or thinks is reasonable to provide on the geotechnical end so that can get incorporated into the conditions of approval. Or did you have a question for me?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
With regard to the part of the property where the home currently exists, and if it's wet as well. So when you've got this great system created with nice clear water
Right.
going through that yard area,
Mm-hmm.
how do you address that to make sure that you don't have an existing problem that,
Is it exacerbated?
yes.
Yeah. So I haven't examined the other end of that culvert out of that catch basin. I will do that in my final design, and we'll make sure it's got a stable outlet. But it sounds like from what Mr. Williams was bringing up that what may be coming through is groundwater underneath the Lazar's existing structure. So what we've proposed here, while the intent is this system is primarily for this new structure, it may have a side effect of lowering the groundwater table locally so that at least the problem's not made any worse. I don't think addressing any groundwater issue on the lower part is necessarily the subject of what we're dealing with right now, but I can tell you with certainty that we're not gonna make it any worse.
Okay.
Anything else?
No, that's all. Thank you. Yes.
Chris Comstock again, 15854 Middle Fork Road. Want to kind of speak to the preliminary versus final report. Vlad, I thank you for bringing it up. I just had this conversation earlier today in Bonner County. It was with the design team. Essentially, until me as the geotechnical engineer, until I understand the improvements well enough to issue final recommendations, I choose not to do it. There's no law against it. You know, we all take a professional standards and there's a standard of care thing, but Hillside Residential is risky, and I don't do it because it's the best business model in engineering. I do it because I have experience and I want to see the industry change toward more thought, more forethought, more team integration. And as a geotechnical engineer, one way I have control over that is by not stamping my report until I understand what's going to be built, while acknowledging I have to consult ahead of time. I'm not a cheeseburger. You don't order your geotechnical report and plug in your property parameters and get it's design, it's creative, it's interactive, etc. So commonly I'm asked to provide a geotechnical report that meets the intent of the Kootenai County Site Disturbance Ordinance where slopes exceed 15%. I do it all the time. And the ordinance lists, thou shalt do geotechnical analysis and issue recommendations that have to flow through the process, either a minor subdivision or the site disturbance plan. So my understanding is that the county will not issue building permit nor site disturbance permit until the geotechnical engineer's stamped and sealed report is provided and that it meets the applicable requirements of the statute. So I think it's a great stopgap, and I hesitate to add an additional level of conditions assessment where where it is, I believe, already built into the project itself. Okay, and it comes down to the licensed professional myself. If I see a development that differs from everything I've testified to here, I have the opportunity to change my report. It's not sitting out there months old with a stamp on it and they change the design after I issued my final recommendations. So by all means, limit construction of this project contingent upon following the geotechnical recommendations. But I think do that at the appropriate time, in my opinion. That occurs somewhere between building site disturbance permit issuance and occupancy. Before it can be habitable, so to speak, there needs to be a final check. And so the way this will work is, if approved in this footprint, the rest of the team can go from 50,000 feet down to 10,000 feet and start developing plans. When the plans are permit ready, let's say 90 to 95% complete, I would reassess them and then issue a final geotechnical report based on the most complete set of plans. And something could change. Often does. The French drain could move around, could change. The elevations could change. The type of backfill could change. So many things can change. I can't release control over my recommendations until I know it's being built. So, anything else on the preliminary final on that one?
But your observation of our county building department is that they know this too, that they are going to look for the final stamp.
That's been my experience every time. They may not understand the nuances of emails and memos and this and that, but they understand, like, this team member needs to be on board and then issue a document. Sometimes after the disturbance permit is issued, before they'll release the permit, they need a letter saying, I actually did see that it was done correctly. And to add to that, I am under contract through it all. I don't take a contract unless I'm retained to do construction observation, to do the final reporting construction observation. It's not a county requirement. I'm not suggesting it be added as a condition, but that's how I operate.
Okay.
And Tim Williams testified as to how wet it is. I would fully agree with everything that he said. It is wet. There's water in the ground. It's on the ground. It's below the ground. In fact, I would maintain that there's 2 days to a week a year where you can't separate surface water from groundwater. It's the same thing, not just on this lot, but on the adjacent properties. And you might not be able to see a spring running out right here that comes out of the ground clear and erodes soil all the way down it, but there's water on those adjacent properties. There's just enough of a depression in this little ancestral draw here that allows it to come to the surface. But from my standpoint, it is a arrow pointing at these people's house. Mm-hmm. And I don't guarantee anything because we do design, we don't build things. But my professional opinion, based on my recommendations, are the groundwater down gradient of this design will be lowered. It will remain unchanged or lower. It will not be exacerbated. That's my professional opinion. There are instances that are very rare where some trench comes through something and no one knows it exists, and water that goes in the ground goes not where you want it to. But if the civil engineer confirms that the piping system is installed correctly, so to speak, then this project, again, Tim, I appreciate Mr. Williams' comment, it should work or it will work. Mathematically, this is the lowest point. It's got a pipe in it, drain rock. It will collect groundwater, and that groundwater will flow down the pipe and out, right? It's physics. It has to do that. So, yes, it's wet, and I would add more pipes, and probably will add more pipes by the time the project is done, because it's a small investment for the amount of protection you receive in drainage. And yeah, I think I addressed the wetness and the downstream water to the home. I think we're improving the situation.
So, as a matter of course, you're on the site on a regular basis once they start with site disturbance, assessing what you observe and seeing whether you're need to make changes. Yeah.
In general, yes, great question. but there are roles, and my role relates to geotechnical. What does that mean? That means I'm recommending things for foundations, foundation bearing, subsurface drainage, and backfill, and like slope angles, so that we can angle it flatter, steeper, or armor it, that kind of thing. When it comes to the actual elevations of the ground, where all the other pipes live, and the stabilization, the revegetation efforts, that's all the civil engineer's lane, if you will. But I take my lane very seriously in ensuring that all the subsurface drainage features are doing what they should in order to route water away from essentially this box. Water used to not just come out right here, but everywhere along here. And a lot of it went in here, but some of it just stayed in the ground and kept seeping. Now we're taking water that was generated through here, and instead of having it come out here, we're putting it right in here. And admittedly, to the lake. Again, as long as the surface water management is appropriately implemented and designed and maintained, I have no concerns about the groundwater degrading water quality myself. So, and yes, I will be there usually 2 to 4 times during the course of things to make sure that my recommendations are followed. And if I have to, I've held up occupancy before when people haven't called or don't want to retain me post-construction. Well, then I can't confirm that it was done properly, and I can't really stand behind my design. I'm sorry. So the golden handcuffs are on in this case. And the owner's motivated to do it right from what I can see.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else, Eric?
We're good, thank you.
And your client is okay with the proposed conditions?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have nothing else. That closes our hearing tonight on case number VAR 22-0003. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.